expected a eulogy, but I brought a confession tape instead. As the greedy congregation stared back at me, I pressed play on the recording that proved they let my aunt die for a payout. My name is Valentina Martin, and if you had asked me 6 months ago where I would be standing today, I would have told you I'd be in the back row of a church, invisible, weeping silently for the only woman who ever truly understood me. I have always been the quiet one in the Martin family, the observer, the niece who showed up for Sunday dinners not to network or borrow money, but simply to eat roast chicken and listen to stories about the old days. But grief does strange things to a person. It hollows you out, certainly, but sometimes, if the grief is mixed with enough righteous fury, it fills you back up with something harder, something like steel. The air inside the St. Jude Cathedral was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying mixture that stuck to the back of my throat. Outside, a torrential downpour hammered against the stained glass windows, turning the colorful saints into blurred, weeping figures. It was fitting weather for a funeral, though the gloom inside had less to do with the loss of a life and more to do with the anxiety of the reading of the will that was to follow. I stood at the pulpit, my hands gripping the polished wood so hard my knuckles turned white. Below me, in the front pew, sat the woman who believed she had won, Charlotte Lee. Charlotte was my aunt, though she preferred to be called by her full name at all times, as if she were a brand rather than a human being. She was dressed in a black ensemble that likely cost more than my car, a veil of delicate lace obscuring eyes that I knew were dry. Next to her sat the rest of the vultures, cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, distant uncles who suddenly remembered they were related to the wealthy Sarah Martin, and various hangers-on hoping for a crumb from the table. And then, sitting slightly apart from them, was Nicholas Baker. Nicholas was my cousin on my father's side, and the only other person in this room who actually seemed to feel the weight of the coffin sitting in the center of the aisle. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed, offering a small, trembling nod of encouragement. He knew what I had in my pocket. He knew what I was about to do. But to understand why I was about to shatter the solemnity of this funeral, you have to understand who lay in that casket. Aunt Sarah was the matriarch of our family, a woman of immense fortitude and, admittedly, immense wealth. She had built a textile empire from the ground up in the 70s, navigating a man's world with sharp wit and sharper elbows. She never married, claiming she never found a man who didn't bore her within 10 minutes, and she had no children of her own. That made me, her niece, and Charlotte Lee, her younger sister, her closest kin. For the last 5 years, as Sarah's health began its slow, inevitable decline, I had been her primary companion. I didn't move into her sprawling estate, Blackwood Manor, for the money. I moved in because she was terrified of being alone in the dark, and she was too proud to admit it to anyone but me. We spent our evenings playing chess, drinking chamomile tea, and listening to jazz records. She was my mentor, my second mother, and my best friend. The trouble began 8 months ago. Sarah had been managing a heart condition for years. It was serious, but manageable with medication and stress regulation. However, a new complication arose, a blockage that required a specific, somewhat risky surgical procedure, followed by expensive, round-the-clock specialized care. I remember the day the doctor broke the news. We were in the sunroom of the manor. The winter light was pale and thin. Dr. Evans, a kind man with tired eyes, explained the situation. "The surgery is her best chance, Valentina," he had said, ignoring Charlotte, who was pacing near the fireplace. "Without it, her quality of life will deteriorate rapidly. With it, she could have another good 5 years. 5 years? Sarah had whispered, looking at her hands. That sounds like a luxury. It's a risk, Charlotte Lee had interjected, her voice sharp. She walked over, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture that looked comforting but felt possessive. Sarah, darling, at your age, do we really want to put your body through that trauma? And the cost, the insurance won't cover the experimental post-op therapy Dr. Evans is suggesting. It would have to come out of the estate's liquid assets. I have the money, Charlotte, Sarah had snapped, her eyes flashing with that old fire. It's not just the money, Charlotte soothed, her tone shifting to one of patronizing concern. It's the suffering. I can't bear to see you suffer on an operating table. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic in the house shifted. Charlotte Lee, who had previously visited perhaps once a month, suddenly moved into the guest wing. She brought with her a suffocating energy. She took over the meetings with the lawyers and the doctors. She utilized a power of attorney document Sarah had signed years ago during a bout of pneumonia. A document intended for emergencies, not for overruling the patient's conscious desires. I tried to fight her. God knows I tried. She wants the surgery, Charlotte, I argued one evening in the kitchen. The marble countertops were cold under my palms. She wants to live. Charlotte was pouring herself a glass of red wine. She didn't even turn to face me. She is confused, Valentina. The medication makes her loopy. As her proxy, I have to make the hard decisions. We are moving toward palliative care. We are going to make her comfortable. Comfortable means dying, I said, my voice rising. You're giving up on her.
Charlotte turned then, her face a mask of ice. I am being realistic. And you, my dear niece, are being hysterical. This is why Sarah put me in charge of the difficult things. You're too emotional. You'd spend every dime of her legacy chasing a pipe dream of immortality. That was the word that stuck with me. Legacy. Charlotte wasn't protecting Sarah, she was protecting the inheritance. She saw the medical bills for the surgery and the subsequent years of specialized nursing as a drain on the fortune she felt entitled to. I went to Nicholas Baker. We met at a coffee shop in town, away from the prying eyes of the manor staff, many of whom Charlotte had replaced with her own hires. She's blocking the treatment, Nick, I told him, stirring my coffee until it was a whirlpool. She fired Dr. Evans and brought in a holistic specialist who just prescribes pain management. Sarah is getting weaker every day. She's breathless just walking to the bathroom. Nicholas looked pained. He was a good man, a school teacher with a gentle soul, but he hated conflict. Valentina, legally Charlotte holds the cards. If Sarah signed that power of attorney, Sarah is lucid, I insisted. She tells me she wants the doctor back, but Charlotte disconnects the bedroom phone. She tells visitors Sarah is too tired for company. She's isolating her. Have you spoken to Mr. Stewart? Nicholas asked. Stewart was Sarah's longtime attorney, a stoic man who had served the family for 40 years. I tried, I said. Stewart says unless Sarah revokes the power of attorney in writing, his hands are tied, and Charlotte never leaves her alone long enough for me to get a lawyer in the room. The situation escalated 2 months ago. Sarah had a bad night. She was gasping for air, clutching her chest. I ran to call an ambulance. Charlotte stopped me in the hallway. She physically blocked my path to the landline, her grip on my arm bruising. No ambulance, she hissed. It's just a panic attack. You'll upset her more with sirens and paramedics stomping through the house. She can't breathe, I screamed. I gave her the sedative the new doctor prescribed, Charlotte said calmly. She just needs to sleep it off. I pushed past her, but she had already unplugged the main hub in the hallway. By the time I used my cell phone to call 911, 15 precious minutes had passed. By the time the paramedics arrived, Sarah had stabilized, but the damage to her heart from the hypoxia was severe. She never fully regained her strength after that night. It was during that chaos that I realized I needed insurance. I needed proof. I stopped arguing with Charlotte. I became the submissive, terrified niece she wanted me to be. I made her tea. I apologized for my hysterics. And while I played the part of the defeated girl, I bought a high-fidelity voice-activated recorder. I hid it in the library, inside a hollowed-out vintage encyclopedia on the shelf behind the desk where Charlotte took her calls. I knew she used that room to make her private arrangements.
3 weeks ago, Aunt Sarah passed away. It was quiet. I was holding her hand. Charlotte was in the other room looking at fabric swatches for reupholstering the sofas, planning her renovation before the body was even cold. When the end came, the house filled with the family. The tears flowed, largely theatrical. Charlotte played the grieving sister perfectly. She wailed, she collapsed into arms, she organized the most lavish funeral the town had ever seen. But I had retrieved the recorder. I had listened to hours of silence, of trivial phone calls, of Charlotte berating the catering staff, and then I found it. The conversation that turned my blood to ice. Which brings us back to the present. The church, the rain, the expectant faces. I looked out at them. I saw the hunger in their eyes. They were waiting for me to say how much Sarah loved them, to validate their greed with memories of her generosity. "My name is Valentina Martin," I repeated, my voice echoing slightly in the vast stone chamber. "And I know you are all waiting for me to tell you what a wonderful woman Sarah was. But you already know that. What you don't know is how she died." A ripple of confusion went through the pews. Charlotte Lee sat up straighter, her veil shifting. She sensed a shift in the wind. "We are told that family is everything," I continued, locking eyes with Charlotte. "We are told that in our final moments, family will be our shield. But sometimes, family is the weapon." "Valentina," Charlotte said, her voice projecting from the front row. It was a warning tone, low and dangerous. "This is not the time for your grief-stricken rambling. Sit down." "I will not sit down," I said, my voice steady. "Not until they hear you." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small device. I held it up to the microphone. I had already cued it to the specific timestamp. "What is that?" someone whispered in the third row. "This," I said, "is a conversation Charlotte Lee had with her financial advisor 3 days before Aunt Sarah died. It was recorded in the library of Blackwood Manor." Charlotte stood up then. "Stop this! She's hysterical! Nicholas, make her stop!" Nicholas Baker didn't move. He sat with his arms crossed, staring straight ahead at the altar. I pressed play. The sound of the recording was crisp, amplified by the church's sound system. The static hiss cleared, and then Charlotte's voice filled the sanctuary. It was unmistakable, that haughty, imperious drawl. "Look, I don't care what the projections say for next quarter. I need the liquidity now." A man's voice on the recording, tinny, coming from a speakerphone, replied, "Mrs. Lee, the portfolio is tied up. Until the estate settles, you can't access the principal." Charlotte's voice again. "She's lingering. It's becoming absurd. Every day she stays alive, the medical costs bleed another $10,000 from the inheritance. That specialist she wanted, the heart surgeon, I fired him, told him she was too weak."
The church went deathly silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. "Is that wise?" the advisor asked on the tape. "It's necessary," Charlotte snapped. "She's practically a vegetable anyway. I'm just letting nature take its course. If I let them do that surgery, she could live another 5 years. Do you know what 5 years of nursing care costs? It would cut my share in half. I'm not waiting 5 years. I've withheld the heart medication Dr. Evans prescribed. I told the nurse she was having an allergic reaction to it. Without the nitrates, her heart will give out within the week. It's mercy, really. Mercy for her and mercy for my bank account." I pressed stop. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone roof above us. It was a physical weight pressing down on every chest in the room. Charlotte Lee stood frozen. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her looking like a wax figure. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Mercy," I said into the microphone, my voice breaking with the emotion I had been holding back for months. She called it mercy. She withheld life-saving medication to ensure her inheritance remained intact. That's doctored," Charlotte shrieked suddenly, finding her voice. She turned to the congregation, her hands waving frantically. "It's AI! It's a fabrication! This girl is mentally unstable. She's jealous because Sarah left me in charge." She looked around for support, but the faces that stared back were horrified. Even the most money-hungry cousin knows that there is a line between greed and active malice, and Charlotte had sprinted across it. "It is not a fabrication." A deep voice boomed from the back of the church. We all turned. Standing by the heavy oak doors was Stuart, the lawyer. He was soaked from the rain, holding a leather briefcase. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He didn't look at Charlotte. He walked straight to the pulpit and stood beside me. "Mr. Stewart," Charlotte stammered. "Thank God, tell them this is slander." Stewart adjusted his glasses. He looked tired, but his eyes were hard. "I cannot do that, Miss Lee, because I have heard the original file. Valentina brought it to me yesterday. We have already submitted it to the district attorney's office. They are currently reviewing it for charges of elder abuse and negligent homicide." A gasp went through the room. Charlotte swayed, clutching the pew for support. "However," Stewart continued, placing his briefcase on a small table near the altar, "that is a matter for the criminal courts. We are here today to discuss the estate of Sarah Martin." He opened the briefcase. "Charlotte Lee believes she is the executor and sole beneficiary of Sarah's estate, based on a will dated 6 years ago," Stewart said. "It is the only valid will," Charlotte cried, though her voice was losing its power. She looked like a cornered animal. "It was," Stewart corrected, "until 2 weeks ago." I watched Charlotte's eyes widen.
"2 weeks ago," Stewart said, looking at me with a rare, small smile, "Valentina called me. She told me that Sarah was having a moment of extreme clarity. I came to the house late at night, entering through the servants' entrance so as not to disturb certain members of the household." He glanced at Charlotte. "Sarah Martin was weak," Stewart said, addressing the congregation. "But she was not stupid. She knew she was being managed. She knew she was being hastened toward the grave. And she knew exactly who was doing it. On her deathbed, with myself and Dr. Evans, who we sneaked in as a witness, present, she dictated and signed a new last will and testament." Stewart held up a document. It was crisp, white, and legally devastating. "In this document," Stewart read, "Sarah Martin explicitly revokes all previous wills. She states that she is aware of the neglect she is suffering under the care of Charlotte Lee, and she designates the distribution of her assets as follows." The tension in the room was excruciating. "To my niece, Valentina Martin," Stewart read, "I leave my personal collection of books, my jewelry, and the sum of $500,000, enough to ensure she can pursue her own dreams without fear." I closed my eyes. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted it over. "To my sister, Charlotte Lee," Stewart continued. Charlotte looked up, a spark of hope in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, family loyalty had won out. "I leave nothing," Stewart read. "Furthermore, I explicitly state that any attempt by her to contest this will should be met with the release of all medical records documenting her interference in my care." Charlotte let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "And finally," Stewart said, his voice ringing out, "the remainder of the estate, including Blackwood Manor, the investment portfolio, and all liquid assets, valued at approximately $45 million, is to be liquidated. The proceeds are to be donated in their entirety to the St. Jude Nursing and Hospice Care Foundation to fund a new wing dedicated to the protection and advocacy of vulnerable elderly patients. It shall be named the Sarah Martin Center for Patient Advocacy." The room erupted, not with applause, but with the chaotic noise of shock. $45 million, gone, out of the family, given to the very institution that Charlotte had tried to avoid using. Charlotte Lee collapsed. She didn't faint gracefully. She simply crumpled into the pew, burying her face in her hands, wailing. It was the sound of a woman who had sold her soul and found the check had bounced. Nicholas Baker stood up and walked over to me. He put his hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Val." "We did it," I said, my hand trembling as I put the recorder back in my pocket. The rest of the funeral was a blur. The priest, looking thoroughly rattled, rushed through the final prayers. There was no procession to the graveyard for most of the guests.
As soon as the service ended, the fair-weather relatives scattered like roaches when the lights turn on. They had realized there was no money to be had, and they wanted to distance themselves from the scandal that was Charlotte Lee. I stayed, though. I stood by the coffin as the church emptied. Stewart came over to me, snapping the latches on his briefcase. "You were brave today, Valentina," he said. "Is she really going to be charged?" I asked, looking at the slump of black fabric that was Charlotte, still sobbing in the front row, unattended by anyone. "The police are waiting outside," Stewart said quietly. "They wanted to let the service finish out of respect for Sarah, but yes." The recording, combined with Dr. Evans' testimony about being fired against medical advice, she's looking at significant prison time, and certainly she will be destitute. The legal fees alone will destroy whatever personal savings she has. I looked at Charlotte one last time. I felt no pity. I remembered Sarah gasping for breath. I remembered the nights I sat up with her while Charlotte slept soundly in the guest wing. "Good," I said. I walked out of the church into the rain. It was still pouring, but the air felt cleaner. Nicholas was waiting for me with a large black umbrella. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "I want to go to the nursing home, the one she left the money to. I want to see it." Nicholas smiled. "I'll drive." We drove in silence through the wet streets. The town looked different to me now. It wasn't just a place I lived, it was a place where justice had been done. When we arrived at St. Jude's, it was a modest brick building. It looked underfunded. The garden was overgrown, and the paint was peeling on the sign. I imagined what $45 million would do here. I imagined the state-of-the-art rooms, the advocates, the doctors who wouldn't be fired by greedy relatives. I stood in the rain looking at the building, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. Sarah had gotten the last laugh. She had turned her own tragedy into a fortress for others. "She would have loved this," I said to Nicholas. "She would have loved that you were the one to do it," he replied. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from Stewart, just a link to a news article that had already gone live online. "Heiress exposes family scandal at funeral. Recording reveals fatal greed." I turned off the phone. I didn't need to read it. I had lived it. "Let's go get some coffee, Nick," I said, "and maybe some roast chicken." "Sounds perfect," he said. As we walked back to the car, leaving the shadow of the nursing home behind us, I thought about the tape in my pocket. I would hand it over to the police station on the way home. My part was done. I wasn't the quiet niece anymore. I was the one who burned the corruption out of the Martin family tree. And as the rain finally began to lighten, breaking into patches of gray and blue, I knew that somewhere Aunt Sarah was smiling. She had played the long game, and she had won.